The Keelung Campaign was a controversial military campaign undertaken by the French in northern Formosa during the Sino-French War. Unable to advance beyond their bridgehead, they were invested inside Keelung by superior Chinese forces under the command of the Imperial Commissioner Lu Mingchuan. In November and December 1884, cholera and typhoid drained the strength of the French Expeditionary Corps, while reinforcements for the Chinese army flowed into Formosa via the Pescadores Islands, raising its strength to 35,000 men by the end of the war. Reinforced in January 1885 to a strength of 4,500 men, the French won two impressive tactical victories against the besieging Chinese in late January and early March 1885, but were not strong enough to exploit these victories. The Keelung Campaign ended in April 1885 in a strategic and tactical stalemate. The campaign was criticized at the time by Admiral Ame d'Acuti Courbet, the commander of the French Far East Squadron, as strategically irrelevant and a wasteful diversion of the French Navy. Background: following the defeat of China's Guangxi Army by the Tonkin Expeditionary Corps in the Keelung Campaign, a two-year confrontation between France and China in northern Vietnam was ended on the 11th of May 1884 by the conclusion of the Shanxi Accord, under which the Chinese undertook to withdraw their troops from Vietnam and to recognize a French protectorate in Tonkin. However, the hopes aroused by this agreement, which seemed to have brought France's Tonkin campaign to a victorious end, were shattered on 23 June 1884 by the Keelung ambush, in which a French column advancing to occupy Lang Son and other frontier towns was attacked near Keelung by a detachment of the Guangxi Army. When news of the Keelung ambush reached Paris, there was fury at what was perceived as blatant Chinese treachery. Jules Ferry's government demanded an apology, an indemnity, and the immediate implementation of the terms of the Shanxi Accord. The Chinese government agreed to negotiate but refused to apologize or pay an indemnity. The mood in France was against compromise, and although negotiations continued throughout July, Admiral Ame d'Acuti Courbet, the commander of France's newly created Far East Squadron, was ordered to take his ships to Foochow. He was instructed to prepare to attack the Chinese fleet in the harbor and to destroy the Foochow Navy Yard. Meanwhile, as a demonstration of what would follow if the Chinese remained recalcitrant, Courbet was ordered on 2 August to dispatch a naval force to the port of Keelung in northern Formosa, destroy its coastal defenses, and occupy the town as a pledge to be bargained against a Chinese withdrawal from Tonkin. Failed French landing at Keelung, August 1884. French interest in Keelung dated from February 1884, when Admiral Sébastien Lespès, the commander of France's Far East Naval Division, had recommended its occupation in the event of a war between France and China on the grounds that it could be easily seized and easily held. When this recommendation was made, Keelung was poorly defended. As tension between France and China grew in July 1884, the garrison of Keelung was substantially increased and the town's defenses improved. And in August 1884 it was no longer the easy target it had been 6 months earlier. Its inner harbor was defended by 3 shore batteries. The recently completed Ta Sha-Wan battery, boasted by the Chinese to be impregnable, the Ta Sha-Wan battery on the eastern side of the harbor, and a third battery on the seaward slope of Mount Clement, a prominent hill to the west of the town. By the end of July 1884 there were 5,000 Chinese soldiers stationed in northern Formosa, deployed around the ports of Keelung and Tamsui. The appointment of Lu Mingchuan as Imperial Commissioner for Formosa in July 1884 also underscored the determination of the Keelung government to defend Formosa. Lu was a veteran military commander, who had distinguished himself in the Taiping Rebellion. Lu Mingchuan was aware that Keelung and the nearby port of Tamsui were likely targets for a French attack. and made sensible defensive dispositions to oppose a landing at both towns. He stationed 2,500 Chinese troops around Keelung, the likeliest target, under the command of the generals Sun Kaiwa and Su Taisheng, while he himself remained with the other half of his army at Taipakfu, occupying a central position that would allow him to move quickly either to Tamsui or to Keelung once the French threat developed. Admiral Courbet, then aboard the French cruiser Volta in the Min River, received the French government's order to attack Keelung on the evening of the 2nd of August. He entrusted this mission to Admiral Lespès, his second-in-command, who left the Min River the following morning aboard the gunboat Louiton to meet the ironclads Bayard and La Galissonière off the island of Matsu. At Matsu, Lespès transferred Bayard's landing company to his flagship La Galissonière, and on the night of the 3rd of August crossed the Formosa Strait with La Galissonière and Louiton. The two French ships arrived off Keelung on the morning of the 4th of August, where the cruiser Villars was already waiting for them. On the morning of the 5th of August, after the Chinese rejected a French ultimatum to hand over their coastal defences, La Galissonière, Villars and Louiton engaged and disabled Keelung's 3 coastal batteries. Admiral Lespès put a landing force ashore in the afternoon to occupy Keelung and the nearby coal mines at Paitao, but the arrival of a large body of Chinese troops led by Lu Mingchuan forced the French to make a fighting withdrawal and re-embark on the 6th of August. French casualties in this unsuccessful operation were 2 dead and 11 wounded. The Chinese suffered markedly heavier casualties. French strategic debate, September 1884. In the wake of the Battle of Foochow, which inaugurated the 9-month Sino-French War, the French decided to make a second attempt to put pressure on China by seizing Keelung. Admiral Courbet argued vigorously against a campaign in Formosa and submitted alternative proposals for a campaign in northern Chinese waters to seize either Port Arthur or Vaiwei. He was supported by Jules Paternotte, the French minister to China. Courbet's proposals, although militarily attractive, were too ambitious for the French government to stomach. The French Premier Jules Ferry fought the Sino-French War in the teeth of parliamentary disapproval, and was unable to give Courbet the resources necessary for a major campaign on the Chinese mainland. A limited operation to seize Keelung, on the other hand, could be undertaken with the forces already at Courbet's disposal. The town could be taken and held by a relatively small French force, and with its nearby coal mines would make an admirable wartime base for the Far East Squadron. A victory at Keelung would also avenge the failure of the 6th of August. The decision to attack Keelung was made by the French cabinet on the 18th of September 1884. For good measure, the cabinet also sanctioned an attack on nearby Tamsui, provided that the town could be captured without damage to European commercial interests. French capture of Keelung, 1 October 1884. On 1 October 1884, Lieutenant Colonel Berthaud Laverlaine landed at Keelung with a small expeditionary corps drawn from the French garrisons in Tonkin and Cochin China. The Formosa Expeditionary Corps consisted of 3 4-company battalions of marine infantry, a marine artillery battery, and a scratch battery of 2 80mm mountain guns and 4 Hotchkiss cannons revolvers. A small force of Vietnamese porters accompanied the combatants. The men of the Expeditionary Corps sailed from Saigon and along Bay in the 3rd week of September aboard the state transports Nive, Tan and Drak, and joined the Far East Squadron off the island of Matsu on the 29th of September. The 3 troop ships were escorted on the final leg of their journey by the ironclad Bayard. On the morning of the 30th of September, the invasion force arrived off Keelung. Courbet scouted the Chinese defences during the afternoon, and gave orders for an opposed landing on the following morning. At dawn on 1 October, Burr's Marine Infantry Battalion was put ashore to the west of Keelung, at the foot of Mount Clement, supported by naval gunfire from several ships of Courbet's Far East Squadron. The French scaled Mount Clement and established a defensive position on its summit, flanking the Chinese out of their positions to the south of Keelung and threatening their line of retreat to Tam Sui. French casualties in the battle for Mount Clement were negligible, 4 killed and 12 wounded. Chinese casualties, according to Formosan informants, were around 100 killed and 200 to 300 wounded. In the first week of October, the French occupied several hills in the immediate vicinity of Keelung and began to fortify them. However, the Expeditionary Corps was too small to advance beyond Keelung, and the Peitao coal mines remained in Chinese hands. Lu Mingchuan had commanded the unsuccessful defense of Keelung in person, with a Chinese division of 2,000 troops. Anticipating that the French would follow up their success with a landing at Tam Sui, he left half of his force in strong defensive positions around Lok Tau, astride the road to Tam Sui, and retreated to Taipakfu with the rest on the 3rd of October. It was rumored that he intended to flee south to Tekcham, and his arrival in Taipakfu was greeted with rioting. Several of his bodyguards were killed and he himself was arrested and held for several days in the city's Lungshan temple. Lu Mingchuan took measures to reinforce Tam Sui. In the river 9 torpedo mines were planted and the entrance was blocked with ballast boats filled with stone which were sunk on September 3. Matchlock armed, Hakka Hill people were used to reinforce the mainland Chinese battalion, and around the British consulate and customs house at the Red Fort hilltop. Shanghai Arsenal manufactured Krupp guns were used to form an additional battery. At Tam Sui, the entrance of the river had been closed by laying down 6 torpedoes in the shape of a semicircle on the inside of the bar. The Douglas steamers Fokien and Heilong running to the port, as well as the German steamer Vela, were, whenever necessary, piloted over the torpedoes by the Chinese who had laid him down. The mandarins engaged in planting the guns that had been brought to the island by the latter steamer. Trade was resumed during the middle of the month at Tuatusha, it being regarded for the time as safe, and the country thereabouts had quieted down to such an extent that a good deal of tea was brought in. Life for the foreigners was very much cramped. They were prohibited from making trips into the country, and even in the settlement, with religious processions, crackers, and gongs going at all times of day, and the watchmen making a great noise with bamboos all night. Rest was well nigh impossible except to the Chinese guards told off to protect foreign Hongs, who after disappearing all day, except at meal times, return at night, and instead of guarding the property, turn in early and sleep as soundly as Rip Van Winkle did till morning, under the impression that the French would attempt to enter the Tam Sui River. Ballast boats and junks loaded with stones were sunk at the entrance. A number of Hakka hillmen were added to the government force. They were armed with their own matchlocks, which in their IGNC Rani they preferred to foreign rifles. Much was expected of them, as the life of warfare they had led on the savage border had trained them to be good shots and handy with their knives. By the end of August the French had succeeded in holding the shoreline at Keelung, but were unable to advance beyond it, and as Chinese soldiers had for some days been erecting earthworks and digging entrenchments on the hills on the east side of the bay overlooking the shipping, the French sent word ashore for the Europeans to come on board the Bayard, as they intended opening fire on the earthworks which were now just visible. The firing was not successful either that day or the next, the nature of the country being in favor of the Chinese, and for many days the shelling was a regular event. The Chinese not apparently suffering much damage themselves, or being able to inflict any upon the French. This condition of affairs continued through September, the French having gained only the summits of the near hills surrounding the harbour. General Lu Mingchuan left Keelung on the 9th to visit Tam Sui and Taipakfu. On his arrival at the latter place he was met at the wharf by some 200 soldiers, 5 buglers, and 2 or 3 drummers. The march up the street with the soldiers in front, the band next, and the general in the rear in his chair, made an imposing parade. His presence is also said to have had a most stimulating effect on the soldiers on guard in the foreign hongs. All appeared in full force with uniforms and rifles. Although for several days the muster in one hong had produced only one soldier and a boy in a soldier's coat. James W. Davidson, the island of Formosa, past and present, Lu Ming Xuan with some 6,000 men was stationed at Tai Phu in the Bangka Plain, while the forces at Ho were daily strengthened, until, in the middle of October, there were assembled about 6,000 men in the neighborhood. Among these were new levies of Hakka hillmen. They were considered by the foreigners to be a dangerous lot to have in the neighborhood, and as they did not speak the same language as the general and other officers, it was feared that misunderstandings might arise with serious results. The other soldiers present were principally northern men, and were said to be well armed. The Hakkas, although armed with their primitive matchlocks, were considered to be brave men and were hardened to the privations of warfare. Their matchlocks are described as long-barreled guns, fixed into semicircular-shaped stocks, with pans for priming powder, and armlets made of rattan, worn around the right wrist and containing pieces of bark cord, which, when lighted, would keep alight for hours, if necessary. When in action, the Hakka pours a charge of powder down the muzzle. On top of that are dropped 2 or 3 slug-shot or long pieces of iron, with owl wadding. The trigger is made to receive the lighted piece of bark, and when powder covers the priming pan and all is ready, the trigger is pulled, and if the weather is dry, off goes the gun. The ordinary method of handling these weapons is to place the lower end of the butt against the right breast, high enough to enable the curved end to rest against the cheek, and the eye to look down the large barrel, upon which there are ordinarily no sights. This method is sometimes varied by discharging the guns from the hip, and it is quite customary for the Hakka to lie flat on his back, place the muzzle between his toes, and, raising his head sufficiently to sight along the barrel, to take deliberate aim and fire. He is able to make good practice, while his presence, especially when surrounded by rank grass, is decidedly difficult to determine. Rev. Dr. Mackay's Tamsui Mission Hospital, with Dr. Johansson in charge, which had rendered such great services to the Chinese wounded and had no doubt been the means of saving many lives, was visited on the 19th by General Sun, who thanked the doctor in charge as well as Dr. Brown of the Koklaffa for their attentions to the sick and wounded. The patients then numbered only a dozen, a good many of the wounded having left, fearing that the French might land again and kill them. Others, seeing their wounds healing nicely, went away into the town. One man who had been shot through the left shoulder, in the region of the collarbone, after a week or 10 days' treatment suddenly shouldered his rifle and left for the front, preferring life with his comrades to being confined in the hospital. It was supposed that the bullet had pierced the upper part of his lungs. Another instance occurred 7 days after the French landing, when a Chinese walked into the hospital with his skull wounded and the brain visible. Several others, shot through the thighs and arms, bones being splintered in many pieces, bore their pain most heroically. Soon after the engagement, when there were 70 men in the hospital, some being badly wounded with as many as 3 shots apiece, there was scarcely a groan to be heard. One of the wounded came to the hospital after having had a bullet in his calf for 9 or 10 days. Dr. Brown extracted the bullet, and off the man went back to the front. Many other instances like the foregoing might be recorded, all of which indicated that the Chinese could recover in a few days from wounds, which, if not actually fatal, would have laid foreign soldiers up for months. James W.